Hello, and welcome to another episode of Live Mindfully with me, your host, Laurie Moore. Today, we are talking about perfectionism, what the research says, the final say on whether perfectionism is helpful or harmful, and why it could be stealing precious moments of presence from your day. Let's get started. So before we dive into today's episode, I wanted to share that I am fresh back from my holiday in Adelaide, where I did something so crazy and wild and fun, and I faced a big fear of mine. I swam in a cage with great white sharks, and it was such an incredible experience. Great whites are beautiful. They are majestic. They are powerful creatures. And I am so glad that they were there to distract me from my fear of breathing underwater. And that might seem like a silly thing to fear, but when I was a kid, I had an extremely traumatic experience where a swim teacher on my very first lesson threw me into the pool. And I sank to the bottom and she left me there. And, of course I didn't drown, but I did develop a fear that I could, and a much too healthy respect for water and its power to kill me. And after that, I flat out refused to ever go to swimming lessons again. And then over time, I was okay in water so long as my feet could touch the ground and my head was above water. And then over the last 8 years, I have been working to overcome this fear. So I started swimming laps at a local pool just so that I could build strength and have confidence in myself that I could get myself out of a situation if I was to be in one. And I started paddleboarding. When I first started that, I hated every minute of it, but I persevered, and now I love to paddleboard. I go paddleboarding as often as I can, and also going into the ocean more and going into the ocean deeper. But I'm still not comfortable being in the ocean, like at a beach, if my feet cannot firmly touch the ground. And last Thursday, for the very first time, I used a regulator in the open ocean, which was a big thing for me. It was a huge thing, really. I have snorkeled in the past. I've only done that once, and that was very stressful for me, and I needed to make sure that I was quite close to the boat at all times, and I would quite often just breathe like normally, lift my head out of the water and breathe. And so to use a regulator, to be in the open ocean in a cage, that was huge. And I'm so grateful that the great whites were there, because I needed a really good reason to put myself in that situation. And well, we're not here to talk about that today. We're not here to talk about overcoming fears, although that would be a really cool episode. So I'll add that into my list. But today we are here to talk about perfectionism. So, have you ever heard the saying, it's better to get it done than get it perfect? Maybe not. What about, if you want something done right, you better do it yourself? I'm guessing that you probably have heard that one. What about Margaret Atwood's, if I waited for perfectionism, I would never write a word? For those who don't know, Margaret Atwood wrote The Handmaid's Tale. Or Salvador Dali's Have No Fear of Perfection, You'll Never Reach It. Winston Churchill said, perfectionism spells paralysis. And my all-time favourite, Brené Brown, says perfectionism is a self-destructive and addictive belief system that fuels this primary thought. If I look perfect and do everything perfectly, I can avoid or minimize the painful feelings of shame, judgment, and blame. Here's the thing. We know perfectionism is bad for our health. And yet so many of us strive for perfectionism every single day, knowing how unattainable it is and how hard we are going to have to work for it. And I am a self-confessed perfectionist. I really admire people now who don't care as much about stuff as I do, about stuff that doesn't really matter if I really think about it. And I used to hear people say, near enough is good enough. And I would think, geez, that's a relaxed approach. Or, that's probably as good as it's ever going to get. And I would think, well, if you tried harder, it'd get better. And then I had an awakening or a moment of realization where I began to assess how much of my time I spent trying to be perfect. And there was something that kickstarted this moment. Someone I barely knew said to me, I was wondering when you were finally going to make a mistake. This person, who I now know quite well, was not speaking in malice. They had simply noticed in a very short period of time that I spent a significant amount of my time making things perfect, all things perfect. And I love moments like this, moments where something that has existed under my nose for the better part of my whole life, I've almost been unaware of. And I guess that's not even true because I am aware of it, but I kind of wore my perfectionism, or the fact that I can do a lot of things really well, as a badge of honor, as a way of pumping up my own value and self-worth. And what I became aware of in that moment when this person made that comment is that people are kind of hoping that I fail at something so that they can see that I make mistakes too. And B, that perfectionism makes people around me uneasy because they know they can never meet my ridiculously high standards. And in a lot of ways, I know that too. And it just makes people uncomfortable to be around someone like that because you're always on edge. And this way of thinking, this perfectionism, has put me under a huge amount of pressure and stress my whole life. The kind that takes joy out of moments and almost paralyzes me when I know I'm facing something that I won't just intuitively be excellent at. Just as Winston Churchill said, perfectionism brings paralysis. And now, 13 years after this person made that statement to me, I was wondering when you were going to finally make a mistake, I'm proud to say that I am sort of working towards and still a long way off being a reformed perfectionist. And I laugh so hard at that because I am thinking about my best friend who is also a perfectionist. And yes, if you are listening, Michelle, you are one. And my husband, who is also a perfectionist, going, oh man, you are nowhere near reformed. But it's really hard. It's really hard to let go of an ingrained and almost, in my opinion, and actually there are studies that support this, there's a genetic component to perfectionism. And for those of you who are curious, the mistake I made was a dark blue linen napkin making its way into a washing machine with all whites. Or as they came out, light blue. And I can only laugh about this now because it seems so ridiculous that I was so upset that I had made such a stupid mistake that I nearly died when I realized what I had done. And then I had to go and tell this person that all their whites and mine were now blue. And the thing is, it was a mistake. I didn't do it on purpose. They knew that, and it was fine. It was no big deal. But when you are a perfectionist, it's a really big deal to you. And that's so silly. Like, it's washing. Who cares? So let's break perfectionism down. In 1980, a couple of psychologists termed perfectionism as a personality trait characterized by overly critical self-evaluation that stands for excessively high performance standards. And in 1965, M H Hollender was the first psychiatrist to describe perfectionism from a psycho-pathological perspective as a demand to oneself or others of a higher quality of performance than that required by the situation. And Hollander's one I think is extremely interesting because this is certainly what I have noticed in myself and others. This need for a higher quality of performance than that required by the situation. Now, since 1965, there have been a lot of studies on perfectionism, and while it doesn't take a genius to work this out, it allegedly takes people smarter than perfectionists because and I do throw myself in the bucket of a perfectionist, we haven't worked this out for ourselves. So perfectionists suffer from higher levels of stress, anxiety, and burnout. And the research shows that perfectionism does not lead to more constructive or meaningful work. And the thing that surprised me a little bit was that it also does not lead to better performance, meaning perfectionists are actually worse employees overall because they spend so much time fixated on doing things perfectly that they neglect other important tasks and projects, which overall impacts on their performance, on their relationships, personal and working, and on their mental health. Now, I'm no genius. I think we've established that. But when I started diving into this data a very long time ago, I made the very quick realization that all this time I spent on doing things perfectly did not actually make me smarter, faster, or better. It was making me mentally unwell and forcing a wedge in my most important relationships. So, see ya, perfectionism. Right? Why would anyone ever want to continue with this personality trait? There's no evidence that this personality trait brings us any genuine level of joy. And even when perfectionists do things perfectly and we receive this jolt of dopamine does not create long-term happiness. Meaning we will very quickly be looking for the next achievement to get the next hit of dopamine. And if you're looking to increase happiness in your life, you'll have much more success if you stick to the happiness hormones like serotonin. Things like diet, sleep, and meditation affect this. Endorphins, i.e. exercise, or listening to music, doing things you love. And oxytocin, spending time in good company with people we love. Out of the 4 happiness hormones, these 3, serotonin, endorphins, and oxytocin, these are the ones you should be focusing your energy and attention on. And so all of this is very helpful to know. But if you are a perfectionist and you are looking at ways to reverse what has no doubt become an ingrained part of your personality, and maybe you're listening to this and thinking, I'm not sure if I am a perfectionist, go and ask someone close to you. They will be able to let you know. So there are things that we can do. And these are some of the things that I did. So the first thing that I would do is throughout the day, all day, every day, and I still do this now, I will remind myself constantly that near enough is good enough. And I check in constantly to see how much time I'm spending on a task. And if that now seems to be too much time given what I am completing. So like Hollender found in his research in 1965, if I was spending more time and eliciting a higher quality of performance than the situation required. So I would just throughout the day take moments to reflect and become aware of how long and how much time and how much effort I was putting into certain tasks, and if that task warranted that level. And then number 2, and this one does make me feel a little bit bad, but it's what I needed to do. I also had to start to limit what I would tell other fellow perfectionists, because I knew they would weigh in on things I was doing and then give advice and make me feel like I wasn't doing like good enough. And it wasn't their fault. I'm not blaming them. It was my thing, and I totally get that. But until I had my perfectionism and the feelings that would arise within when I knew things weren't like 100% perfect, until I had that under control, there was no point putting myself in situations where I could feel my anxiety rising because somebody else was weighing in. So I just became more aware of when I walked away from a conversation not feeling good about myself, and then I would be a little more restrictive in the future conversations with that person until I felt as though I had more control over my triggers. So, as an example, no one knew I was starting a podcast. I had floated the idea back in April of 2022 with a couple of people, and very quickly, because I knew how important this was to me, I just decided to keep my mouth shut. I didn't want other people weighing in, and I knew or expected that I would be asked a lot of questions, and I maybe didn't have answers to those questions, and I also knew that I would find it triggering, so I just kept it quiet until I released the very first episode 7 months later. And the last thing I do and continue to do is name it to tame it. So whenever I notice that I have fallen into old patterns where my perfectionistic nature was showing up, I would simply say, or I say to myself now, okay, my old friend perfectionism has shown up, and I will take some deep breaths and just remind myself that I am safe, that I am calm, that this feeling will pass. And then I try and work out why I wanted or want something to be perfect. And 9 times out of 10, I've noticed that I get worried about things being perfect when I'm concerned about what somebody else is going to say about me. So I have a fear, a very real fear, that I'm going to be judged. And I think that's really common. I think a lot of us, or a lot of perfectionists, have this fear about being judged. It's one of the reasons why we try to do everything perfect. And not only are we going to be judged, we're going to be judged in this very negative light, and critical things are going to be said. And we don't want this. We're trying to avoid this feeling. If we are perfect and everything we do is perfect, then no one can ever say anything negative to us. Right? And we need to address that. We need to see what those triggers are, what we're worried about, and then we need to practice reflection, maybe journal on ways to minimize that in the future within ourselves. People are going to say things maybe. We've got to decide whether or not we want to take that on board. So let's recap. Step 1, awareness and reflection. Remind yourself that near enough is good enough. Not everything, in fact, most things don't need to be perfect. No one is going to die if you accidentally wash a blue linen napkin in a pile of whites. I've done it. I promise you, no one died. Step 2, watch for triggers. Notice when the fear of being judged arises within you and what it is that triggers this feeling. Maybe it's your upcoming work appraisal, or speaking about a new idea with a fellow perfectionist, or asking for any kind of feedback. Know your triggers and minimize them. And lastly, step 3, name it to tame it. This is a science-backed technique that helps to manage bigger or unwanted emotions that elicit a negative response in the body. So the idea behind this technique is simple. Name the big emotion, and that's all we're doing. Identifying the way we feel. And this helps to activate the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain used for reasoning and problem solving, comprehension, creativity, and impulse control. And simply by naming it, we activate this part of the brain. And research has shown a reduction in stress and anxiety in the body when we do that. And that's it. I want to thank you so much for listening in to today. If you have enjoyed today's episode, please follow and rate this podcast, and please share it across your socials. Don't forget to tag me. My Instagram handle is @lifewithlaurie_, or my Facebook page is Live Mindfully with Laurie Moore. Have a great week. It is the final week of the school holidays. Next week we are all back on deck, and I am secretly looking forward to it. I have had an amazing time off with my kids, but I am yearning for some alone time and, most importantly, some routine back in my life. I'll be back next week with another great episode. Until then, take good care of yourself.